Hi everyone, it's Jen again. I hope you're having a good week, and for today's video I'm going to be answering a question that I got from last week to talk about drawing more feminine characters. So I want to preface this by saying that this is just my opinion. Take it with a grain of salt. And I'm going to be referring to just artistic depictions. In no way, shape, or form does this reflect any of my ideas of women and men, or beauty, attractiveness, sexiness, etc. And none of these ideas really translate to how I feel about people in real life. I kind of see art as a completely separate thing where I'm just drawing ideas and they don't really reflect reality. They have ideas that are rooted in reality, but they are an exaggerated, deconstructed reconstruction of that idea. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to be kind of breaking this down into three sections. What I believe conveys femininity in art, with the least impactful to the most impactful. Least impactful, I believe, is the underlying anatomy of the character. The second most impactful would be that character's clothing and style, which would include like their hairstyle and any like kind of body grooming, or makeup, or tattoos, etc. And three would be how the character is posed and the characterization of that character, just how they carry themselves, what their how they would speak, or how they would interact with others, with a lot of that being conveyed through their like posture and their body language. Okay. So let's start with like the simplest, would be the underlying anatomy of the character. So what do I think is feminine? It really doesn't have to do with like, I guess, organs, because again, when I think of feminine, it doesn't have anything really to do with whether that character is necessarily a, a man or a woman, or non-binary, or if they are, how well developed they are in any of those anatomical senses. It has more to do with like the idea of feminine, and I don't equate feminine with sexiness either. So one of my kind of like, I guess, pet peeves with what I think of as being sort of like lazy character design is this idea of like, well, if it's a feminine character, if we're trying to portray this, I'm going to just kind of like show that this character like has a large chest, or I'm going to like make them in skin tight clothes, so that it can emphasize, their round chest, their round hips. I think there's a lot more subtlety to be said for what distinguishes like feminine from more like masculine, and I'm gonna show in this like kind of like crude sketch here that I have. So I think one of the interesting things about the anime style in particular, or in cartooning in particular, is that because the art is so simplistic, a lot of like non-artists will think that like cartooning is like very easy because like, look, you didn't have to render that much. But in actuality, because the lines are so simplistic, the placement of those lines and the relationship of those lines to each other is incredibly important. And so you can be a little bit off and it can convey a completely different thing. So this face here on the left side of my screen is supposed to be a more feminine looking face, and the face on over here on the right side is supposed to be a more masculine looking face. But if we actually overlay the one face over the other, there is very little in the lines that have actually changed. The only thing that I did was make the bridge of the nose a little bit longer. The face is a little bit less round and tapered as far as like the chin line there. And the eyes are a little bit higher set and closer to the brows to again kind of create that longer nose bridge and kind of more elongated looking face. But the actual length of the face has not changed, and like a lot of like kind of stereotypical shortcuts for depicting femininity as far as like fuller lips or larger eyes or thicker eyelashes did not have to be conveyed here in order to make one face look excuse me, more masculine than the other. With the other kind of I guess tricks used here was like a thicker neck and then broader shoulders. Being the other two things that I changed from one drawing to the other. But I wanted to be very specific here to show that the underlying measurements of the actual face were not drastic at all. They're just very slight and subtle, deliberate changes that have made the characteristics that we associate with masculinity and feminine more pronounced. Again, this face looks longer, but the actual shape of the head is not any different. And, you know, the chin looks wider, which it is just slightly wider. But like as far as where the jawline is, it is not wider. It is actually the same width as the original drawing. So it's just the chin that's a little bit wider. And this whole idea of like kind of the more feminine being more round and tapered is going to be repeated in pretty much everywhere along like the body to kind of emphasize that idea of femininity. One of the reasons too why I wanted to kind of show that these shapes are all like very similar is because if you've ever seen like pictures of or tutorials, I should say, if you've ever seen tutorials on like how to apply like a natural makeup look, or seen like celebrities without their makeup on, a lot of traits that we associate with like femininity are not actually as pronounced in real life without any makeup as we think they are. And it's makeup's job not to just like apply color. Color is probably one of like the least important things. It's about creating emphasis on the characteristics that look more feminine. So really, I think that if you are trying to like paint these characters' faces, you should try maybe doing it in black and white first and seeing how applying light, like highlights and shadow, creates contour that emphasize like that rounded tapering of the chin, that kind of shorter, perkier nose bridge. Shorter, and I say perkier by default because it's shorter. It tends to make the end of the nose look more like perky or cute. But in this case, again, they're the same size. And all the very elaborate contouring around the eyes it helps kind of give that kind of like larger, more expressive eye look that we associate with like femininity. But the actual like physical changing of like the size of the eye does not happen, but it's amazing how much like optical illusion that we can create with just fake light and shadow, because it's not even the actual light and the shadows casted by the light. It is all applied with makeup that you can be able to emphasize wherever that light and shadow is hitting and kind of create the illusion of there being more contour than there actually is. Okay, so that's, I think, all I really have to say for faces at the moment, for structurally, and then we can move on here to the bodies. So again, I have like the more feminine body on the left side and the more masculine looking body. I don't draw very muscular men as a general thing. It's not something that I'm super interested in drawing most of the time. But I think again that it kind of like forces one to be a little bit more deliberate with what subtle changes that they have between the two figures. Because I am taking it from the perch of like, well, it's not just that the guy is like taller, and it's not just that the guy is wider and like, you know, has like huge arms and huge legs. In this case, I actually made the more masculine figure a little bit more slender in the legs, but not because like he's supposed to be smaller than her, but because again, with the idea of the kind of curves and tapering, that is makes the figure look more feminine. So in the case of the figure here on the right, there's a couple different things. So even here where you see with like the shoulder going into the arm, here there is tapering going into the elbow and more of like this round kind of forearm, and very narrow tapering here at the wrist going into the hands. The torso here, if we, I don't know what's going on with my tablet, it's being weird. Okay, let me pick a different color just to emphasize. The waist is set higher, so it's shorter torso, upper torso here. And then with it coming out to the hips, so the waistline here is pinched tighter, but again, this is to emphasize the roundness and the curvature of where the hips kind of like come out here. And then we have kind of like more tapering here from like the thigh to the knee. We're going for a more rounded shape and a more narrow tapering here at the knee. And then again with the calves, going for a more like narrow tapering here at the ankle into the feet. With the more masculine figure on this side, I want to just show with the female, the more feminine looking figure underneath, his hips are not wider than the female character. What makes his hips look narrower than the more feminine looking character onto the side is the fact that I gave this character a longer torso, okay, a less narrow waist here, and so because the body was not pinching in as much, it made the hips look less pronounced, even though they are physically, this distance is just as wide as this distance. It's all how shapes are relative to each other. And with the legs here again, because I did not have the knees come in as much, I did not have the calf taper into the knee as much. It's a little straighter. And again, I'm sorry, with the thigh, and then with the calf going into the ankle would be this ankle is thicker, very slightly, right? Everything is very subtle, but it's very deliberate. And then I think I did make the feet like just a little bit larger. The hands would be just a little bit larger. And again, the wrists would be less narrow. So everything in the more masculine looking figure is just more straight. It still has all like the curves. They're just kind of more elongated and more subtle than the more feminine figure. The neck is a little bit wider. The shoulders are a little bit wider, but not drastically so. You know, like this is not a huge amount here. Okay. Which brings me, now that we've covered point number 1, which would be like the structure, the underlying anatomy, I'm going to talk about the clothing and style, which I believe to have more importance than the underlying anatomy, and let me demonstrate how. So, I wish I hadn't drawn those lines on there in red, because, okay. What's with my eraser too? I must have been blending. I should have done this on a new layer. That part wasn't very smart of me. I guess I should have planned this out in advance. Okay. So much like when I was talking about the application of makeup, I'm going to talk about clothing and style in the kind of the same way, where you don't necessarily have to have everything be skin tight or showing cleavage in order to have have a feminine looking figure. Now you do have to have intentionality, because just putting somebody in baggy, loose clothing or shapeless clothing is going to tend to make them look more neutral and more masculine kind of by default in that regards. Alright, you know what we're going to do. This time I'm going to be smart about it, and I'm going to put a new layer on top. So what I was talking about before, what kinds of lines can we create with like clothing that give a more feminine appearance? Things that narrow the neck, right? So like whether it be like a choker, you know, or a tight turtleneck kind of thing, like that tends to look more, if it narrows and elongates the neck, that tends to look more feminine. If it narrows the shoulders, so if you have something kind of cropped this way, that tends to look more feminine. This can be offset, like you can have more kind of like masculine designs with like things on the shoulders here, but it usually want to offset it with something. So like if I were to like try to make this look more masculine with like shoulders, I wouldn't have like the straps necessarily going in, like, you know, like that, like how I just did. I would probably make it more going like that, so that we're not narrowing the shoulders. Things that emphasize or raise the torso. So things like crop tops almost always look feminine, and you can offset it with something, or you can put it on a masculine character to kind of subvert that shape. But as a default, it tends to look more feminine. Same with anything that has kind of more an imperial waistline. If it is anything that kind of like has a line separation there at the waist, tends to be a more feminine looking shape. Even if it kind of flattens out the hips, just having that separation up here tends to have more of a feminine shape. Even any type of detail that is high or mid-waisted tends to have a more feminine appearance. Okay. Things that narrow the wrist. You know, these are very kind of popular looking thing in a lot of like female character designs, whatever those arm guard type things. That tends to look more feminine. along with anything that like sort of like widens the hips or like kind of like brings attention to the hips. So having things like kind of crop around here, you know, like that's a very like popular thing. So this is kind of more a recent thing when you have kind of like more like the low rise type stuff, but oftentimes it is offset with like kind of emphasis here. So if you just have kind of like a lowly cropped type thing here, but then you just do kind of like a loose shape down here, that tends to look, you know, especially if this is a loose shape up here too, that tends to look more masculine. Okay, but like if you do kind of like a more loose thing up here, like having tight around the ankles, almost like that kind of almost like belly dancer look. If you have something kind of tapering at the ankles and then you have something kind of cropped up here with that more feminine shape that I was talking about up here, then that kind of offsets the fact that this is like a lower hip line that would generally be more associated with a more kind of masculine emphasis there. If it was paired, why am I on the wrong layer again? How did I even get onto this layer? I don't know. I don't know how I got onto the background layer. I didn't see myself do that. Okay. So yeah, things that tend to cut around here, you know, tend to look more feminine because again, it brings kind of emphasis to this like kind of point, this thickest point here where then things start tapering in. And whenever you bring like attention to like kind of like the fullest part, that's going to make it look more full, right? Bikini is so popular for that reason, right? As far as like the overall shapes. And I kind of mentioned before, like as far as like having kind of emphasis on the narrowness of the ankle, you can have big baggy pants, and as long as you kind of have that emphasis on that tiny ankle and kind of makes those ankles look a little more tiny, then that tends to have a more feminine appearance as well. And you can do that with sleeves as well, like big sleeves, and then like kind of having some type of way of kind of narrowing the wrist there before it goes into the hand. Will tend to be a little bit more feminine. And then if you can kind of like emphasize how small the emphasize or make the shoulders look smaller in the process, then kind of like that lines that I was talking about again, then that can also be kind of like a very feminine looking design. Okay. Talking more about like making, in contrast, those shapes more masculine is pretty easy. Again, instead of having like a higher waistline, which tends to like kind of bring in the waist more, we have like a lower waistline which extends the torso. It makes it look more masculine. Okay. Another thing I forgot to say is if you ever have like anything that's puffy, whether it be short skirt, kind of like bloomers, anything that kind of puffs out around here, this area, and makes this area look more round and emphasized, is going to have a more feminine appearance as well. The way jackets cut. If you have something that cuts more up here, that's going to tend to have a more feminine appearance, because again, bringing more emphasis to a higher waistline. Or if you have anything cut shorter in general, it's going to tend to look more feminine, versus if you have a coat that is more cut lower, again, extends the torso, makes it look more masculine. Same with detailing, such as like you know, like scarves, I don't know, robes, details, long lines up here, emphasize, you know, longer, elongating the torso, has a more masculine appearance. I think I've pretty much spoken about that. Anything that makes the wrists look look wider tends to have a more masculine appearance, as well as the ankles look wider. Tends to have a little bit more of a masculine appearance as well. Lastly, I don't really have any illustration to talk about the pose and the characterization, but I think it pretty much speaks for itself. Like, if you try to think of the most masculine looking character out there, I'm just gonna say like the Incredible Hulk, big, bulky, masculine looking character, and then you put them in like there's a Google search for anime girl pose. Immediately, they're not necessarily gonna be considered feminine looking, but they're gonna be coded as feminine acting, and so your audience is gonna be like, why is this, very masculine looking character behaving in a feminine way? And what are you trying to say in that? And it's going to either confuse them, or they're gonna think it's funny, or they're gonna wonder why, or you're gonna have to do some explaining, I guess is what I'm saying. Like that isn't something that they would expect to see, and seeing that pose or characterization, it doesn't really matter how masculine or feminine your character looks, if they are basically behaving in a way that is the opposite, that is going to mean something that will somewhat challenge the way that they look. Okay. That's all I've got to say on the subject. I hope you found it helpful. If you have any more questions, or you'd like me to go over anything else, please let me know. And thanks for the suggestion. Have a great week. Bye. Oh yeah, and don't forget to enjoy the process. It's so important. Bye.